A few weeks ago, I was speaking at a meeting of the clergy, and we were thinking about the theme of reconstruction. And I started the meeting by turning us to Nehemiah chapter 1, where Nehemiah hears of what's happened to Jerusalem. And his immediate reaction is to weep, to mourn, to fast, to pray for God for months on end. And that got me wondering about leaders and the church, expressing their grief to God for the state of the church, remembering that it's God's desire that his church should be presented holy and blameless. And that took me to have a look at Lamentations. Lamentations appears in our Bibles just after Jeremiah. It's thought that the author was Jeremiah, and that's been assumed right from early days until very recently. It's said that the style of writing is very similar to that of Jeremiah, and as we work our way through the text, there'll be certain clues. So things like some of the passages could only have been written by an eyewitness or somebody who'd actually spoken elsewhere about the situation, both of which point to Jeremiah. Then there's the introduction to it in the Septuagint that refers to Jeremiah as author. And then in 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verse 25 there's a reference to Jeremiah and lament, and it's assumed that it's referring to Lamentations. Verse 25, 2 Chronicles chapter 35, Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. They made these a rule in Israel. Behold, they are written in the laments. Now, Lamentations is about a band of pilgrims. They're travelling back to Jerusalem after the exile. Now that dates the book at round about 586 BC. So we know the likely author, Jeremiah. We know the likely date, 586 BC. And the book describes, if you like, these pilgrims' reactions as they catch their first glimpse of Jerusalem. They see the blackened ruins of the temple, so scarred that they hardly recognise it. The book itself is made up of 5 poems or laments, and they're expressing emotion. The tone is going to be agonising and melancholy and plaintive. But it's not an emotional outburst, rather it's a tale of suffering and starvation and despair. The book, or the poems, are an attempt to reflect on the meaning of human suffering and to interpret the catastrophe that has fallen on Jerusalem. And from it, we will gain, I hope, a perspective on suffering. Now, it's important to see that each of these 5 poems are what we call acrostic. Each verse in each of the poems begins with the corresponding letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So verse 1 begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, verse 2 the second, and so on. But it's not always obvious in English. Listen to this. This is a translation of the beginning of chapter 3 from the ESV translation, the English Standard Version, which is generally regarded as one of the more literal English translations. Verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of his wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand, again and again the whole day long. Now it's really difficult to bring out this feature of the poetry in English or in any other language. However, a writer, a poet, philosopher called Slavit did attempt to capture it in English. Here's the start of his translation of Lamentations chapter 3. Verse 1. Afflicted am I and beset, a man whom God in his wrath has abased. Abused by his rod and broken, I am driven into the darkness. Against me he has turned his hand, and again and again. Then, bones broken, wasted, I am besieged and battered. Bitterness is my portion and tribulation. Banished I dwell in the darkest darkness like those long dead. Verse 3. Chained so I cannot escape and walled in. I am a captive. Crying for help I call out, but he will not hear my prayer. Crooked are all my paths, which he has blocked with boulders. But why use an acrostic structure? Well, an acrostic structure is useful when it comes to memorising the poem, A, B, C, D, etc. Another explanation is that the acrostic structure conveys completeness. There's a Jewish saying that the law should be obeyed from Aleph to Tar, A to Z. That is, in its entirety. Similarly, the acrostic form conveys the idea that every grief, every lament, every question should be expressed to God. The idea is to pour out your heart to God from A to Z. The alphabet provides space for lamenting each aspect of the tragic experience. So because of their acrostic structure, the chapters in Lamentations don't necessarily have a strong logical flow to them. That's not their primary concern. It's far more important that everything be expressed to God. So it's about, if you like, it's okay to lament. And they occur elsewhere in the Bible: Moses, Joshua, Jeremiah, Isaiah, David, and of course Jesus in Matthew 9 or Matthew 27. So if you like, we're saying it's okay to pour out our hearts to God. Be it pain, mercy, grief, anger, everything can be brought before God. But there's also an important note here as well, which will help us with the application of the book. It's communal rather than personal. It's collective grief and the feelings of the whole people of God as they make their way back to Jerusalem. How does that help us? Well, the people of God today are Christians, the church. So Lamentations gives a message relevant for the church. It helps us make sense of where the church is at today and how we, as a collective, as a church, should respond. And if you're after similar principles for an individual, for you personally, then have a look at what are called the Psalms of Lament. You'll find them in the Psalms. So Lamentations helps the church see how we can collectively give voice to the deepest agonies of grief as we look at it today, with the hope that some comfort may come from crying out to God for mercy.